We're talking about the Buffalo Bills salary cap situation with special guest Greg Tompsett from Cover One today on Locked On Bills.
You are Locked On Bills, your daily Buffalo Bills podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bills Mafia? It's Joe Marino from the Draft Network, and I'm your host of Locked On Bills. Happy Friday to you, and thank you for making Locked On Bills your first listen every day. And as a reminder to you, we are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. And when I say that we hope that you make Locked On Bills your first listen every day, I hope that that comes after you consume Greg Tompsett on the Cover One Salary Cap Spectacular, where he and the guys did a phenomenal job like they do every single year, breaking down the Buffalo Bills salary cap situation. And so hopefully this is a great supplement to that conversation that you can find also free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. And really thankful for Greg joining me. Once again, he's a reoccurring guest on this podcast. He's one of my go-tos for Bills discussion, for salary cap discussion, for what do I do about my 3-year-old daughter that you've been through this before type situation. So Greg and I, we cover a lot of bases, but
it's a versatile skill set.
It really is, my guy. I appreciate you, and thanks for joining me.
Absolutely. No, it's fun. This is one of my favorite times of year. Obviously I love football like everybody else, but this stretch is, I think, very akin to your stretch as you really come down the stretch for the draft, where you've put in so much work, you've researched so many things, so many different people are coming to you with questions and recommendations of things. It's really, you like your time to thrive in what it is. And this stretch from like right now through that first crazy window of free agency is just like, this is my Super Bowl. This is when I really get to have a lot of fun and looking forward to. Obviously I had a great time, Wednesday night with the guys and looking forward to talking about with you folks here.
Well, on behalf of so many people, thank you for completely being willing to read things like the CBA and learn about the nuances of the salary cap and contract structure so that we can come to these types of conversations. So, Greg, let's get into it. We're talking Bills. We're talking salary cap. What is right now the Buffalo Bills salary cap situation entering this offseason? Where are they at?
I have great news. We're over the cap by $16.5 million. Yay. It's not great.
Well, but it's a starting point for the conversation, right? Because if you don't know about all the stuff, all the levers, all the things that can happen, then you're probably like, oh boy, over the cap. We got to get rid of players. It's not going to be a better team. But let's get real about all of that. So right now there's $16.5 million over the cap. That is going to change. And so let's start talking about how the Bills can get under the cap and create cap space so that they can add to this roster. So not including extension candidates, I like to put that into a bucket by itself. What are those existing contracts on this Buffalo Bills team that appear almost obvious that the Bills have to do something with them to create some cap space? Let's look at some of the restructure candidates, cut candidates, those types of things.
So we'll start in the restructure bucket, and I've got 2 automatics and 4 maybes. The 2 automatics are Josh Allen. His base salary, we can do a restructure of his, shrink it down, create $21.5 million. It's already guaranteed. We already owe him that money. It's just spreading it out. There's also obviously no chance we're going to release Josh Allen over that stretch. So it's a very low risk maneuver. Technically, if you keep doing that, you would balloon a future season and make it really unpalatable. We'll have to deal with that in future years if we get to where, hey, we've already restructured twice. We probably shouldn't do 3 in a row. This is the first year. It's an automatic. It's a slam dunk. $21.5 million. Josh by himself gets us from 16.5 below to 5 million above. And now we're at least above water. The other one is, I think some people are a little more anxious about this one, but when Von Miller's deal was agreed to, it was 6 years for a reason. The reason it was 6 years is the maximum you can prorate a contract is over 5 years. So they gave him a smaller bonus last year and then also gave him a guaranteed bonus this year. Again, it's guaranteed. We don't have a choice. We owe him that money no matter what. We also have year 2 through 6 already on the books. So it was already planned to prorate this from a roster bonus into a signing bonus because it creates another $10.8 million in cap space. It does technically kick a little bit down the road. This is already a guaranteed 3-year deal. So years 2 and 3 of this is what it is. It's guaranteed. He can't go anywhere. Technically, if we wanted to move on before year 4, we're now adding, an extra 4 million of that into that year, an extra 6 million in the third year. That, maybe isn't ideal. This is probably hoping that he can stretch out a 4th year. And now coming off an ACL injury, that's not guaranteed. But this was already planned ahead of time. Those 2 deals are 32.3 million. Just doing those, we now have 15.8 million in cap space. Miller might be anxiety inducing, but it's going to happen.
So there you go. I mean, 2 cornerstone players, or should be, right? Josh Allen, Von Miller, a base salary restructure for Josh Allen, a roster bonus conversion for Von Miller, and you go from 16.5 over to having 15.8, just right at about $16 million in available cap space. And that's even before we get into the maybes. And so let's now get into some of those maybes, those other levers that Brandon Beane can pull.
So basically, anytime you're looking for restructure candidates, it's who has a high base salary. There's 4 guys who their contracts have a reasonably high base salary: Matt Milano, Deion Dawkins, Tre'Davious White, Stefon Diggs. All 4 of them can create between 5.6 and 6.5 million each. We've already done restructures with a couple of them. You don't always go back to the well multiple times. Different guys are at different ages. My guess is that we restructure 2 of them. I can't guarantee. If I had to guess, it would be probably Diggs and Milano, because we just did Dawkins and Trey White. So if we did Diggs and Milano, it's right there at 12.1 million. That would create another 12 million. Now we're at almost 28 million in cap space without releasing anyone, without losing anyone off the roster. Now we're at 28 million if we just did 2 out of those 4 maybes.
And I think that's a good way to look at it. So we did the 2 automatics, Miller, Allen, that gets you to 15.8. You pick 2 of these and you free up another 12.
Yep.
And so you're at 28, but you could be at another 12 on top of that.
You
right?
could be at 40 already.
Yeah, sounds pretty good, Greg. So hopefully you didn't just look at overthecap.com and see 16.5 million over, because there's some reality that kicks in with this. And that gets us to the next way for Brandon Beane to create cap space. And that would be cut candidates. And there's a few, maybe not like last year. I think we had this conversations like you knew it was Darrell Williams, you knew it was AJ Klein. So maybe not the slam dunks, but certainly some candidates this year.
Yeah. So I would say this is a good sign that we don't have those obvious contracts where, oh, that guy's definitely not worth that, we have to get rid of that guy. That's usually a bad thing when you have those. So this is one. It does stink a little bit that there aren't some easy ones just to lop people off and save the money. The ones that are toughest are guys who you actually probably still might want around, but maybe not at that number. So the 2 that are in that bucket for me are Nyheim Hines and Tim Settle. Nyheim Hines, we traded for a deal where Indy had already paid the signing bonus, so all we did was take on non-guaranteed salary. It's $4.9 million. So that's not ideal in the way that it's set up. That's probably not a number we want to pay him. He is, in my opinion, kind of a roster spot bonus because it's the 3rd down back, backup running back, and primary kick return and punt return guy. In most teams, that's 2 roster spots. So you're getting 2 roster spots. If we lost him, it would likely be 2 different players who would fill those roster spots. So now the replacement cost is probably closer to 2 million if you think about it that way. There's also an incredibly rich free agent running back class. He and his agent know that as well. So I think he's a perfect candidate you approach with, hey, we traded for you last year. We weren't able to use you the way that we would like. This year we're going to. And if we now use you that way, because last year's stats were deflated, we can convert some things over to some not likely to be earned incentives. That helps us cap-wise. You can feel pretty good about earning that money back, and we get you down to 2.5 million of a cap number, which is more palatable and is probably as good or better than what he'd get on the market. And if you play really well, you can earn all $5 million, and we'll deal with that in 2024. Tim Settle is very similar, where we're going to have 4 defensive tackles. He's just 25 years old. We probably want him to cut him, takes 2.7 million in dead cap. So say it's Eli Ankow instead of him. It's not Eli Ankow for $1 million. It's Eli Ankow for 3.7 million because you ate the 2.7 million on cutting Tim Settle. So if I can get, that's the number in my mind, negotiating with Tim Settle. He's right now a $4.9 million cap hit. If we can get him down below 3.7, I'd rather have Tim Settle than Eli Ankow. But I need it below that number. Now, is that a short-term extension at a reasonable number that lets us bring it down? Is it a restructure on a, just a not likely to be earned incentive like we did with Hines? I think you need something there. And the third one is Isaiah McKenzie. That there's not a lot of dead cap. You can cut him and release 2.2 million. I think some fans will ask about Saran Neal and AJ Epinesa. You're going to pay a gunner. I think you could maybe save a little bit of money, but you still need someone to be a primary gunner. I think Tywan Jones is going to retire, is my guess. AJ Epinesa, you could save 1.4 million, but you're still going to pay someone to be that rotational fourth defensive end. So I won't be heartbroken if either of them get released. I also think there's not as much savings as what it is because you're still going to pay someone those. So the net savings isn't as high.
Yeah.
My guess, we save 2.5 million on Hines. We save another 2 million on Tim Settle. We release McKenzie, get that up to maybe 6, almost 7 million. And now we're at 34, almost 35 million.
Pretty good spot to be. And it didn't even hurt, right? Like, I think that's what I enjoyed about you getting through some of these most logical paths to creating cap space. Nothing hurt. I mean,
we've lost one player so far.
That's exactly right. Isaiah McKenzie. And I'll be honest with you. Okay. So that's a world that I can live in. And there's still stuff left on the table. So I think this gets us to a really good point where in just a moment, we can start talking about extension candidates. We can get into some contract projections for some of the bigger name free agents that Brandon Beane has to decide on. But first, I need to tell you about Built Bar. If you're looking for a delicious treat, but you don't want the fat and calories, and you got to try Built Bars. Of course, everybody's trying to eat healthy all the time. And that's why Built Bars are the right snack for you, because not only are they healthy, but they are delicious, and they're delicious because they're covered in 100% real chocolate, and they have so many great flavors. And then there's the healthy part. The macros are off the charts, only 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 17 grams of protein. You got to try them out. And look, I've been telling you for years to go to built.com to order them, and you still can. But you can also go to your local Walmart or Sam's Club and pick them up off the shelf. So check them out. They're the best tasting protein bars on the planet. You'll thank me later. All right, Greg, we got some extension stuff to get into, some contract projections here in this segment. But first, I want to talk a little bit about you and what you have going on. We got into it just a little at the open here with this kind of being your Super Bowl, really leaning into your expertise with salary cap and roster construction and those types of things. But you've also launched a new show, the Greg Tompsett Sports Show, which reveals, we're only 1 week into this thing. You can catch the second episode tonight. But you're talking about all the sports, all the stuff. What's going on with that?
So it's always an interesting catch-22 that, like you said, I kind of built my reputation and any whatever level of internet notoriety I technically have based on my knowledge of contracts and of the Bills specifically and salary cap and those kind of things. So you're incented to lean into that. Like I need to do that because that's what people expect. That's what people come to me for. That's what they see me as a source of information on. So all of a sudden it kind of builds this niche for you in that world. And all of a sudden that's all you're looked at for. And that there's nothing else outside of there. And I love sports. Like I'm a sports fanatic. I could watch anything all the time and want to just be able to go have a good time and watch that. And I love talking about sports with my friends. So this is really kind of a creative outlet for me. I'm curious to see how it goes and what level of success it may or may not have, but I'm at least going to have fun doing it and be able to go and be a little more lighthearted, a little less analytical, goofing around and joking around with what I enjoy with sports. I know a lot of people like the 60-second classics from Mike Camerlango. They're always incredibly entertaining. I had Mike on this week, and tonight we're going to talk about ranking our top 5 sports movies and going through there and just having a fun conversation. And I'm looking forward to it, and I hope people enjoy it and are willing to give it a shot.
Now, if Rocky IV is not the number 1 sports movie, then this will be the last episode that I listen to.
I can commit to you it is on the ranking.
All right.
It is on the ranking.
Thank you. We can also continue our conversation with that knowledge because it would have been over right here, Greg, if you didn't have Rocky IV on the list. Let's talk about some of the extension candidates. I think this is sometimes an overlooked way to create cap space. Maybe there's some players you like on the roster and you extend them, and that allows you to kind of move some of the money around and reduce their cap hit this year. You create cap space, and was curious if you, I know you have, I know you've looked through this roster and come up with these extension candidates. Anybody come to mind here for you in this bucket?
So again, trying to walk fans through my process, the first thing I do is who is going to be a free agent next year. So whose contract is coming up after the 2023 season. Those are always the most logical extension candidates because they're coming up here. And besides Stefon Diggs and Josh Allen, the Bills don't really break from that tradition of extending guys 1 year out. So you have some names out there, Micah Hyde you technically could save $4.5 million by extending him and shuffling money around. He's coming off the spinal fusion surgery. That's a little tough. Tyler Bass and Gabe Davis are both very logical extension candidates, but not to save money because they're at the tail end of day 3 rookie contract numbers. So there's not a huge opportunity to save money there. The two are on the defensive line. So Ed Oliver is one. He's a $10.7 million contract. He is the most logical and the biggest opportunity to save money if you extend him. He's also probably our biggest trade asset. Like, we don't have a lot of tradable players. I guess maybe Gabe Davis is probably an argument. We're not trading Josh Allen, or despite what Mike Florio wants to say, we're not trading Stefon Diggs. The two most tradable pieces of value in the marketplace versus not a contract that would hurt us if we trade them are Gabe Davis and Ed Oliver. I don't think they're going to trade Gabe Davis. I think there's a chance that there's a front office who had Ed Oliver as a, elite prospect and thinks they could unlock all of his potential more consistently in their spot. So although he is an extension candidate, we could save money by extending him. We could also save $10.7 million by trading him. So I do think it's possible that comes into play. I think it's more likely he'd be traded than extended, but they could do either and save money. The number one for me is Daquan Jones. I think he was a revelation when he got here. He was everything we thought Star Lotulelei was going to be, but at half the cost. We're basically paying him $6 million and change each year. The powerful run stuffing one tech D tackle also ages pretty well. We've seen guys play that well into their 30s. I'm comfortable giving him 2 more years after this, probably playing around with some void years. I can save $4.5 million and guarantee myself more Daquan Jones in my life.
Yeah, I like that.
Give me that. Give me that. So out of these, that would be mine. I could get us up to like 37 million with a Daquan Jones extension, 48 million if we traded Oliver. My guess is we just extend Daquan Jones.
I don't want to deviate too much here, but I have some follow-ups based on the stuff you talked about there. The first one I think is going to be the most easy question for you, and it's about the idea of extending Tyler Bass. Greg, are you ready to live in a world where the Bills have a $5 million a year kicker? Because that's what it's going to cost.
So I will differentiate between kicker and punter. I think there are things I'm willing to do for the assurance of having a trusted kicker. I've watched the anxiety of these other fans.
Dude,
look at what
right?
Dallas went through. Look at what Dallas went through, where you can't even trust you're going to get an extra point when the whole idea of, hey, if we get in range for a game-winning field goal, that conversation is different for Kansas City, for Baltimore. I want to be like that. I want to be like, listen, if we get over midfield, we've got a shot. And if we get to the 40, it's money. Now, do I love allocating $5 million to it? No, I don't. Do I want to just roll the dice that we can find some other guy in the draft and watch all these other teams struggle with it? No, I don't. So I'd love to get creative with it. I'd love to play around where he gets some assurance early, and maybe those $5 million cap hit years don't start until 2025, 2026-ish. I think that's doable. We can keep it manageable in the first couple years. Kickers age well. He's very young. There's no reason to think we won't. Now, on a punter, I don't want to go over that. I like Sam Martin. I'd welcome him back. He'll come up in some other discussions. I'm not going to go market level for a punter. If we have a kicker, I'll go market level for a kicker, even if it pains me a little bit.
Let's talk about Gabe Davis as a potential extension candidate. I think we would both agree on it's unlikely to happen. But Gabe Davis, whatever you think about Gabe Davis, he's positioning himself to be a $15+ million a year wide receiver. If he has the same year he had last year, I guarantee that's where that contract's going to fall, right? Somewhere in that range. And with what you're paying Diggs, with what you're paying Knox, let's be real here. I mean, can you really pay another offensive weapon north of $15 million a season?
So, one, you're spot on. And if you're representing Gabe Davis, all you're going to do is go to the Bills and say, hey, go look at the year 3 production for Christian Kirk, for Mike Williams, for Kenny Galladay, for Tyler Lockett, for Cortland Sutton. Because Gabe Davis did the same thing as them.
Yeah.
They all had downfield, high A-dot approaches with low catch rates because it's high A-dot downfield attempts. They all got between $15 and $18 million a year.
Mm-hmm.
So that's 100% what he's going to be looking for. Now, you can layer it, and we'll talk about contract layering here in a moment, with when you have an older player that's coming up on their numbers, you can build a contract that's pretty palatable for Gabe Davis and doesn't get big in cap hit numbers until Stefon Diggs is ready to come off. That only helps if you think he's going to take over for Stefon Diggs, or if you think you're going to draft a guy who's going to be a number 1 player on a rookie contract over that same period of time. I don't know the answer to that. I didn't see the consistency this year that I'm ready to necessarily lock down that number, but I 100% believe that's what Gabe Davis is going to get paid. He is going to be a $15 to $18 million receiver. I think there's a way that we can creatively structure a contract where that makes sense for the Bills, including doing it this summer and doing it this offseason. I think more likely after the season, but there's absolutely a path where they can keep the cap number in line. Right now he's $2.9 million. You can build a pretty long-term extension where that doesn't blow up and stays in the $3 million range this year and keeps him on the team with a $7 million cap hit next year, and still pretty manageable, but puts him at that big number. What we'll find out is how frustrated was Brandon Beane and the offensive staff with the things the fans were frustrated with versus how much they understand why they happened because of the usage and the routes that he was asked to run and the downfield attempts. We'll see what they think when we see if they negotiate it or not.
I listened to the way Brandon Beane talks about Gabriel Davis, and I feel like not only would Brandon Beane like for Gabriel Davis to stay on the Bills forever, but maybe even build a house for him in his backyard. I mean, the guy loves him, right? I mean, yes. the way he talks about Gabriel Davis is just glowing. He's gushing about the guy. And so I think
that's a fair thing to read into.
Oh, and I always do. And I'm willing to separate the way I think about a player and then what the team says. And that's what matters when I'm trying to predictively think about what the team's going to do moving forward. Last one here is Ed Oliver. He's a big discussion, Greg. I mean,
there's flashes. There's flashes of dominance.
I think he's a good starting 3-tech in the NFL. He's just not a dominant player that's worth, living up to a top 10 status. And then it gets harder when you think about Wilkins, Simmons, Lawrence, who were picked after him. They're just better players than he is. And then now he's got this $10.7 million cap hit. So this leads to the discussion. Now, okay, you want to trade Ed Oliver. All right, cool. That's interesting. Does that clearance of that $10.7 million get the Bills now in the conversation to pursue Javon Hargrave in free agency? I think Deron Payne's going to be tagged, but you think about Draymond Jones, who's probably a $15 million a year interior defensive lineman. There's low-key some guys. I mean, even Sheldon Rankins. You think about Larry Ogunjobi. There's some free agent players that you can put into that. Is this a situation where you move on from Ed, but it opens up an opportunity to bring in someone else? Because that's where I get hung up on this conversation is, I like the idea of getting those assets, but I also like having a starting 3 technique. So where does that conversation go for you?
So it's It's the same conversation of we're going to get to other pending free agents and contract projections. Anytime you project not retaining a starting player, you are now creating an opening in the starting lineup. So not having Ed Oliver, the solution isn't going to be Jordan Phillips and Tim Settle. It's
No,
not.
God, it can't be for me, brother. I'll tell you
Correct.
that.
So now, does that all of a sudden everybody's projecting O-line and wide receiver in the first couple picks in the draft? Well, all of a sudden, does that supersede that? And now we're looking for a 3-tech to be able to jump in and start day one. We know the development timelines for rookie defensive tackles. It's probably right there after tight ends is one of the slower developing positions. So what I will say is clearing $10.7 million and with a player at his caliber, I think we're talking about a reasonable return. I think you're talking about a day 2 draft pick coming back for a guy
Like a
like
2
Ed
and a
Oliver.
5 or something like that.
Yeah, with his pedigree, you're talking about like a material return on that. What it also does is with $10.7 million, I can be pretty creative in what I structure. Like I can create a world where Draymond Jones comes in and counts $6 million in the cap hit in the first year. And all of a sudden now I'm actually probably upgrading a little bit.
Sure.
Giving some structure, retaining additional assets in the draft, and saving $4 or $5 million. So I think that's absolutely a path. I think that's absolutely one of the excuse me, one of the options that they're going to look at is can we just better utilize the combination of a draft pick return, or some have thrown out simplified things of, do they then trade him to the Raiders for Hunter Renfrow or trade him to the Broncos for Jerry Jeudy. And you plug another hole with that one. And there's different things. Player for player trades are very uncommon in the NFL. It's much more likely it would be draft pick compensation. Now, all of a sudden you're adding in another premium draft pick on cost control at one of those positions. That's an extra guard. That's a guard and a tackle in the first 2 rounds, plus a receiver, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And you can now repurpose that $10.7 million more palatably with a guy who can play alongside Daquan Jones and be the defensive tackle pairing looking for, which I think your worst case scenario is we get good flashes, inconsistent play for a lesser amount, or we get the upside of that. That's probably the worst case scenario because any reasonably paid defensive tackle who gets to play next to Daquan Jones is going to look decent. Or the upside is we get consistent play at a cheaper price tag and everybody's happy. So I think there's a lot of paths where it makes sense. We don't have a ton of other tradable pieces. So I think trading Ed Oliver is a significant temptation for Brandon Beane.
We got plenty more to get into with Greg Tompsett here. And certainly we're talking a lot about roster management and GM type stuff. If you're into that, check out Ultimate Football GM. This is the type of game where you can become an NFL GM and run a football franchise and try to build a dynasty. If you were to play the game Ultimate Football GM, you're responsible for hiring coaches and coordinators, trading players, navigating your franchise through free agency and the draft with all the ups and downs of a season. All this in a challenging and realistic game world. Ultimate Football GM is completely free, playable offline. So if you're on an airplane, you can play it. Play on the go as you want and when you want to. In fact, we have a league for Locked On fans across the world that you can check out and be a part of. Just go to the Locked On League in the app to join and see if you can create a football dynasty. In fact, Locked On Bills listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using promo code Locked On in the game store. That's Locked On, so make sure to check it out today. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up on the app stores. That's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. All right, Greg Tompsett,
but
what's
before
up?
we jump into the next one, this is the second time you've gotten me. I've already bought Built Bars, and I enjoyed them. They're delicious. I'm gonna go download Ultimate GM.
Listen,
that's right up my alley. I'm gonna go download it and start playing it.
Yeah, no, it's fun. I think you'll like it. So glad I can. Good day to have you on the podcast with those being the two presenting sponsors today. Let's work through some contract projections. I want to talk about restricted free agents and then tie a ribbon on our discussion here today. Greg, make sure everyone's following Greg on Twitter at Greg Tompsett. Again, Cover One Buffalo podcast, the Greg Tompsett Sports Show, A lot of great content coming from Greg, and he's got a lot of expertise as you're learning right here if you're unfamiliar with Mr. Tompsett. Some contracts here. The Bills have over 20 unrestricted free agents. There's a lot of names here, but I want to get to, like, to me, the most interesting names in terms of contract projections. And look, these are not necessarily contracts that I expect the Bills to give them, but like, what deal is this player going to sign this offseason? So I have 5 players queued up: Jordan Poyer, Tremaine Edmunds, Devin Singletary, who I think is fascinating, Sam Martin, and Jordan Phillips. So let's get into Jordan Poyer. What is your expectation for his market this offseason?
So obviously, like, I do all my projections. I go through my process of what, how I would comp them to other players, where I see the logic of previous guarantees and things like that. And then I always check with other guys that I trust, Mike over at, Spot Track, Brad, who does the projections over at PFF. I know both of them. I talked with both of them. Their projections for Poyer confuse me a little bit. So I'm curious to see. I think that Jordan Poyer is 2 years, 25 million. I don't think he's going to get the Harrison Smith deal. I don't think he's going to get the Quandre Diggs deal. But some of them have him down at like 8 million and change. I tease Brad all the time. He hates defense. I think that his projections on PFF are a touch of what he thinks the market will do and a touch of what he would do if he was a GM. And I think that skews why some of his wide receiver, offensive tackle, offense numbers are higher, and every linebacker and safety is oddly low, in my opinion, of what I think they're going to get on the market. So we'll see. He's very good at what he does. Maybe he's going to prove correct on these, and maybe GMs start to value the premium positions the way that he does. I think Jordan Poyer is a 2-year, $25 million guy, which I don't think he's going to get from the Buffalo Bills. If Brad's right and he's an $8 million guy, that means he went out to the market. It was softer than he expected. If that's the number, I think that's way more possible that he's a Buffalo Bill. But I think that's going to be like third week of free agency, kind of tail between the legs coming back. I don't see that being the scenario. I think he's going to get paid by one of those Atlanta, New York, Jacksonville, Houston, one of those teams that want to bring a winner into the locker room and pay him that money. But if he doesn't, God bless him. I'll take him back at a discount.
Well, when Miss Rachel Bush put on the Instagram that they packed up their house for the first time since 2017, I'll tell you, that was a pretty good sign to me that we watched the last game of 21 back there with Hyde. So
that's the plan. I can guarantee you that's the plan.
Yeah. I don't feel good about it, but man, it's like what's hard about that though, Greg, is we went through this entire conversation, and we're at somewhere between 35 and $50 million in created cap space, and you can bring back Poyer. You can do it.
Absolutely.
But
absolutely,
we'll see. Does he feel so disrespected? You know what I mean? And if money's the most important thing, if there's a team in the state of Florida that wants to sign him for the same deal, there's no income tax. Like there's things
and both
that
of
I
them
think
are from there.
Right.
Both of them are from there. The same thing. D'Amico Ryan's looking to bring some leadership into a locker room in a zero state tax state as well. There's a lot of openings where I could see it happening, where I would predict that to be the more likely outcome. But there is a path where he loses the game of musical chairs and ends up coming back.
Yeah. Give Hyde another year. Say, hey, 2 more years, guys.
Yep.
I'd love that, brother. I loved watching those two players. As good of a duo at a position as we've ever seen in the history of the team. Tremaine Edmunds, this is a big one. Where are you seeing his numbers? Where are they going to land?
Same idea. We just saw the extension that Fred Warner signed, 19 and change. Shaq, Darius, whatever he wants to go by, Leonard in the Colts now, 19 million and change. We saw Roquan Smith hit $20 million per year. We laughed about CJ Mosley, who's still up there at 17.5 million and is playing well. I think Tremaine Edmunds is just below those guys. I don't think he's in right at their tier, but draft profiles like yours are prevalent within the NFL. There are plenty of other teams who saw him as a top elite talent that have seen him improve each year, that have seen him make the Pro Bowl multiple times, get all pro votes this year, have his best season in a contract year, which is dangerous, but God bless him, he did. I think he's a $17.5 million guy. I think he's young enough where you can do it in a 6-year, $105 million deal, where you can make the first year cap hit $7 million. You can make the second year cap hit $9 million. I've done posts on cover one, showing my structure of how I would build that, where you don't start to have big money numbers for Tremaine Edmunds until Matt Milano is 30 and in his final year of his deal. And that's how you layer contracts. And that's, you could build the same thing with Gabe Davis and Stefon Diggs. You could build the same thing with, different players when you have an up and coming player with a well-paid player at the same position. So I think people who are hoping that there's some $14 million deal out there for Tremaine Edmunds are sorely mistaken. I think he's going to get paid that. I think if he reaches the open market, you could have some bidding between players and he could be 19 or 20 million. I don't think that's crazy. I think that's absolutely possible. So really, if Brandon Beane values him as a $14 million player, all you're saying is we're going to let him walk and he's going to leave. And maybe we get a comp pick bingo that maybe that's what the time that it is. Or if you're ready to sign him to a market level deal, you're just signing up for that. And we can play around with the numbers of how they need to work, no matter what it is. Even if it's a 6-year, $120 million deal and we match Roquan Smith, I can still make the first year cap hit $7 million. And that's what they care about right now. I can still make it work where it's 3 fully guaranteed years, and then we'll see. And that I can make it palatable in 2023 and 2024, $7 million and $9 million in cap hits. He gets a boatload of cash, and then we figure it out later. So Beane has to decide, am I in for the market level, or are we going to let him walk? If he walks out that door and hits free agency on Monday, March 13th, or whatever that date is, he's going to get an offer, and it's going to be scary because they can structure it in a way that it's not as deflated early in those different things. So I predict either Tremaine Edmunds is retained by the Buffalo Bills and does not hit free agency, or he leaves the Buffalo Bills.
Wow. That'd be a tough one to let walk. You got 5 years invested in this guy. He's been a key part of your defense. Second ever draft pick ever by Brandon Beane. Like, all the reasons make sense, but the fact that he didn't get the deal done before the season and it was Dawson Knox, right? Like, they could be just realizing that they want to maximize their market and like not agreeing to terms with the Bills who aren't going to franchise tag you. You can get to those negotiating tables and realize that there's a bunch of money out there for you.
Yeah, it's a tough one. It's a tough one.
Devin Singletary is like not the biggest name here, but he's the most fascinating to me because I think the timing could not be worse for Devin Singletary to hit free agency. There's a good crop of free agent running backs. It's a good draft class for running backs, and I just don't think that plays into Devin Singletary where, like, in a vacuum, I think you would look at contracts like what Chase Edmonds got last offseason or what Melvin Ingram got and say, you know what? I think Devin Singletary is a $6 or $7 million a year running back. I think the timing is going to kill him. What do you think for his market?
Same idea. It's the exact same idea. I think there's a lot of guys who've gotten those 3-year, $18 million deals. I know that's what his agent's looking for. I'm looking more at the Gus Edwards deal. Gus Edwards got 2 years, $9 million, $4.5 million a year to be a contributing running back. I think Devin Singletary is a contributing running back at the NFL level. You mix him in as one of the 3-headed monsters we saw in the Super Bowl with the Philadelphia Eagles.
Yeah.
He probably produces pretty similar to Miles Sanders or to Kenneth Gainwell or to, to Scott. He can do those things. I don't know if the Bills see that with their current challenges, with the other contracts we're talking about here, with the needs they have at some other positions. There's an awful lot of temptation of James Cook, cheaper Nyheim Hines, and, day 3 thumper X, Mohamed Ibrahim, whoever. So someone that you're going to tell all the fans about here to get excited about in the coming months. There's an awful lot of paths where, hey, that looks awful good to have a $4 million total running back room rather than paying Devin Singletary $4.5 million. And of course, I can structure it to make it cheaper in the first year. I just don't know if it makes sense to build it that way. I don't know. Do they want to dedicate those carries to him? Do they see, was that part of the plan with James Cook and Nyheim Hines that, hey, that's a starting caliber backfield in the NFL. We can work with that. And you bring in the thumper to be able to help when needed and to milk the clock in the fourth quarter. And now you're set and you're good. If they already had that plan, they may have made this decision on draft day and at the trade deadline already. And that simply is what it is. And it's not what his value is. It's simply maybe he wasn't part of the plan going forward.
No, Devin Singletary, durable. Great teammate, the way that
Consistent.
Josh Allen and McDermott talk about it. Yeah, consistent. And he's grown. Like, I think the receiving skill set has gotten better. The pass pro has gotten better. And this year, the short yardage got better, right? So I think there's a lot to like about Devin Singletary. Just, I feel for him in the timing here.
I'll add, there is a path very similar to the Jordan Poyer path that we talked about. I don't see any longer term deal that he's on the Bills. It's possible, but I don't see it. There is a path where he goes out there, sees the other 12 free agent running backs ranked ahead of him, loses the game in musical chairs and says, hey, guys, can we just run this back and try it again next year? And he comes back for 1 year, $2 million, and we just try again next year. I think that's possible. That's the path where I could see him back with, like, well, for that amount, sure, we'll just use the draft pick on something else. That's a possibility. I don't know that I see it a longer term extension with the Bills and Singletary.
Two quick ones here. Sam Martin, Bills punter, expired. I know money was kind of a factor last offseason. Didn't really find it. Had a great year for the Bills. And then Jordan Phillips, I want to kind of lump in here to move past these projections. 1 year, $5 million deal with the Bills. I'm getting concerned about Greg, not about you. I'm getting concerned about Jordan Phillips in the last 3 years for him, where it's been injuries, right? They've been a problem for 3 years now. And he's an aging player. So where do you think those markets land?
So for Martin, if you look 2 million, 2.5 million is like the 11th, 12th highest paid punter. I'll do that. If I'll give him more than the minimum, I'll give him a little bit better. I'll give him 3 years, $6 million. If he wants more than that, he was good. He wasn't that good. Like he wasn't, we weren't getting coffin corners.
He's a veteran player, like
he's trusted.
Right.
He would be a great fit. He could be here for 3 more years and everyone would be happy. If he's cool with that and that he'd rather take 2 million from us than 2.75 million from someone else, God bless him. I hope we bring him back. I'm not going to go way above that. 2.5 million is probably my cap. But somewhere in that 3 year, $6 to $7.5 million deal, you can also then deflate this first year cap hit, keep it down at 1.5 million, something like that, and everybody's happy. Jordan Phillips is tough. When he was on the field and healthy, he was easily a $5 million player. That rotational, penetrating, disruptive backup 3 tech is exactly what he should be. The end of the year is the reason that everybody's nervous about it. Is that shoulder going to get better? Is it going to stay in socket this year? Is he going to have some other, cascading injury because of what he dealt with in the other areas? We saw a calf injury. We saw other pieces. It's harder to trust that. And that, you see the flashes, you see the value when he's out there. I would need something really low guarantee, incentives built in for games played, which would be not likely to be earned incentives. So I can build something where he costs us like 1.5 or 2 million and can earn $5 million, because if we get 17 games of Jordan Phillips, that's worth $5 million. That's where both sides are happy. I need it to be games played is how he earns those checks. Yeah. So if we can build something around that, sign me up. He missed a bunch of games last year, so you can set that bar fairly at a reasonable level to exceed it, that if he hits those numbers, he gets it, and they're not likely to be earned, so it won't hit the cap for this year. But my guess is we find a way to do that we also keep Martin. And out of those 5 players you proposed, I think we walk away with Edmunds, Sam Martin, and Jordan Phillips. And you could probably fit them in on a first-year cap hit of $10 to $12 million and make it pretty palatable.
Looks pretty good. And I think the other players the Bills have are unrestricted free agents. I mean, it's probably minimum deals are close to it, right? Yeah. No real needle movers with that.
We saw it with Levi Wallace and other players in the past. Isaiah McKenzie. You don't need to retain and tender an RFA to keep them. We didn't tender both of them, and then we re-signed them both back for minimum deals. Guys like Terrell Dodson, Dane Jackson, Cam Lewis. I think those are roster caliber players to come back to camp and fight for a 53-man spot. Beyond Dane Jackson, I don't think you guarantee anything. I'll guarantee Dane Jackson the cornerback 5 job. Like, he can come back. I'll give him that. He's on the roster. He's a good depth piece. I don't want him to start, but he's a good depth piece and valuable experience. Beyond that, everybody else can just come for fight for a roster spot.
Well, one of the most interesting dynamics, to me at least, maybe not to everybody else, about this offseason for Brandon Beane is it's really going to challenge his roster building philosophies as it relates to core special teams players, because he's tight on cap, right? We talked through this. There's certainly paths to create a lot of cap. We have to see how willing he's going to be to do all this stuff. But when you look at those core special teams players that don't really help on offense or defense, they're all like expired contracts, whether it's Tyler Medikevich, Jaquan Jones, Cam Lewis is a restricted free agent, Tyrell Dotson, AJ Klein,
Taiwan Jones.
All these guys, man, they're and even Saron Neal is one that you have to look at based on just the cap hit and where you're at. I mean, and then you look at the one player that he's kind of added so far, it's Zane Anderson, who's a special teams player, right? So there's some really interesting dynamics, and that kind of gets us into these restricted free agents here. Tyrell Dotson, Dane Jackson, Cam Lewis. Real quick on this, can you explain some of those dynamics with being an RFA as it relates to those three players who have been on the team, right, for like multiple seasons now?
Yeah, so it's when you have it means you haven't accrued 4 years of NFLPA seasons being on the team yet. So the team still owns your rights, because basically if you get a UDFA or sign a guy, it's the same as having their draft control. That if you drafted a guy in the 7th round, you'd have 4 years of control. If you find him as a UDFA, you have 4 years of control. The ones we see most often are when you have like Ryan Bates. Last year, we needed to tender him because then we could match an offer, and you hope that nobody matches it and you get him back for that number. This year, that right of first refusal is $2.6 million. That was tolerable for a starting caliber guard. It's not a number you want for a backup special teams linebacker, a backup corner / safety, or a rotational level corner. I think it's maybe debatable with Dane Jackson. I don't think they do it. The first round tender is $6 million. No one's going to sign any of those guys to a contract to give you a first round pick. The second round pick is $4.3 million. No one's giving you a second round pick for any of those guys. There's no purpose signing them to that. I don't think any of those guys would get a contract all that close to $2.6 million. Maybe Dane Jackson, I guess. I don't think they do. I think that we do not tender any of them, but that we re-sign all 3 of them to minimum contracts and camp invites to give them a shot to make the roster.
Yeah, that makes sense. Greg, let's get out of here on this question here. We've been through all the different possibilities or the likely possibilities that Brandon Beane can create cap space. And so 2-part question here. What do you think the realistic ranges of available cap space that the Bills will have? And then from there, I always ask you this, like, what is your message to Bills fans? You've done this work. There's Brandon Beane in his front office, and then there's Greg Tompsett in terms of who's dug into this information. What type of message do you have to the fan base about expectations for what's going to happen here in free agency and the trade market and all that type of stuff as we examine this team through a lens that's a Super Bowl window? But I think every year everybody gets a little bit concerned about, will this team be good enough to compete, right? Will they have to make concessions? So that range, and then just your message to the fan base as we get out of here.
So if we flipped every single lever, we could create $80 million in cap space. We're obviously not going to do that. That's restructuring 15 different contracts and releasing everybody who's not bolted down. Realistically, I think we can create about $35 million in cap space. That's, usable cap space after, having money set aside for in-season, having money for the draft picks, and all the restructures and other reasonable moves that we talked about. Now, that $35 million doesn't count any of the contracts we just talked about re-signing. So that would be Tremaine Edmunds, Poyer, like that would use up that space if we wanted to. My message for Bills fans is, last year, going into free agency, we were $3 million over the cap. Everybody was panicking about how we were going to do anything. Brandon Beane restructured a bunch of contracts, signed 11 free agents, including one to a 6-year, $120 million deal, added a full draft class, and traded for 2 guys in season. It's doable. It's doable. It's not this nuclear winter. We don't need to batten down the hatches and get ready for only losing players and not keeping anyone. And they can afford to bring back every single one of their 24 free agents if they want to. I can make it work, and Brandon Beane and his team are smarter than I am. So it's doable. It's not going to be this horrifying nuclear winter. Now, that means there's probably not going to be some huge splash deals. The biggest splash deal is, do we keep Tremaine Edmunds or not? That's the one. Now, if we don't do that, maybe that gives you a coupon for one other thing. If we trade out Oliver, maybe that's a coupon for a defensive tackle signing. There's a couple areas where maybe we get a little bit bigger of a name. I don't think we're going to be all that involved on day 1 and day 2 of free agency. I don't think it's going to be those kind of big splash deals. But the idea that we're not going to add anyone, I don't think is realistic. And I'll plant a seed. There is a path where if we know we can't afford Edmunds, Poyer, all of a sudden it flips it to where, hey, maybe we shouldn't sign any of them. We recoup some comp picks. We go after trading for players and signing released players, and we still improve the team, but we add and start that clock on getting comp picks next year where we could add a third and a fourth or even 2 third-round picks, depending on what Poyer and Edmund signed for. So there's a couple different paths to it. They will improve this team. It is going to get better, but it's probably not going to be the crazy splash deals we've seen in the past.
Yeah, it's not the time to lay down. I mean, the Bills are a good football team. They won a lot of games over the last few years. They're one of only 2 teams that win a playoff game in the last 3 seasons. I mean, no reason to lay down. The division's getting tougher, right? I mean, the gap is closed between the Jets and Dolphins. They gained ground. They did. But it's just there's no reason to think that, okay, they have to take take your medicine year. There's no reason to think it. And we just went through a conversation all about that. Greg, one day we'll have a 30-minute conversation. Today's not that day. I appreciate your time. As always, I thank everyone for joining us. Would love you to subscribe, share, rate, review the podcast. Send Greg some love for his contributions and what he does for this fan base to keep us super educated when it comes to these roster construction dynamics. Greg, thanks for joining me, my guy.
Always one of my favorite conversations every year. Appreciate you.
All right. For everyone else, thanks for joining me. Have a great weekend. Go Bills, and I'll catch up with you again on Monday.